welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and I made a video a little while back called 3 Mistakes When Building Your Commander Decks, and everyone seemed to like it, so I'm making another video called 3 Mistakes When Playing Your Commander Decks. And I made a video a long time ago, back in the beginnings of my channel, called the 5 Worst Commander Plays, something like that. Very specific plays that I see in the Commander format that I just don't think are very good. But these are 3 specific sort of strategies when playing your Commander decks that I see all the time that I think people should avoid. So these aren't specific plays, it's just the way you are playing your deck, things that I think people should do that will make the outcomes better in your Commander games. And I talk about it all the time on my channel. One of the most important things that you should do is not make yourself a target. And I talked about this again in another video about my 5 rules for Commander deck building. This is a 4-player format, and that really changes the whole strategy of a game, in my opinion, as opposed to a 2-player format where you are the only target for your opponent. In a 4-player game, making yourself not a target can be a huge strategic advantage for you. And of course, when you're building your deck, that's important, but it's also really important when playing your deck. And that comes into my first mistake that I see, which is getting out of the gate too fast. A really fast start, in my opinion, in a Commander game can actually be a bad thing. People seem to think that's a good thing. It's a good thing in most formats. In a 4-player format, I don't see it as necessarily a good thing, unless you plan on ending the game really fast, which in a casual Commander game, you probably do not. You just think about the first turn Sol Ring into an Arcane Signet, right? That play that I'm sure we've all seen a lot seems like a really good first turn play, but what you've actually done is made yourself the arch enemy on turn 1. The game has now become 3v1 on your very first turn. That doesn't seem very good, right? I know a lot of people will think, oh, well, you have so much mana on turn 1. It's a big advantage for you. It's worth it. I don't think that it is. Playing a 3v1 game, even if only temporarily, is such a massive disadvantage for you, right? All your opponent's removal, 3 opponents now using all the removal on you, is such a massive disadvantage for you that the upside to what you're doing, I don't think is worth it. And as I've talked about before, it will sort of trickle down to the rest of the game. Even if you get that first turn really fast start and you don't really do much with it, it still sinks into your opponent's head that you had that really quick start, and it will carry on, I think, with the rest of the game. So I think a really fast start is actually a bad thing. I don't play Sol Ring in my decks at all anymore, because we all know that is one of those cards that sort of just grabs people's attention, especially on turn 1, right? And that's what I'm talking about here specifically, is turn 1 Sol Ring, that automatically makes you a target. Always. People see that first turn Sol Ring and now you've gotten their attention, and I think that's a really bad strategy. If you actually play Sol Ring, and I'm not saying you shouldn't put Sol Rings in your deck for this reason. If you do though, and you have that Sol Ring in your opening hand, I think the good strategy here is to actually not play it on turn 1. I know people will think that's crazy, but you would be surprised the difference it makes. And this is what I used to do. When I had Sol Ring in my deck, I would actually wait until turn 2 to play it. Even though I had a land and a Sol Ring in my opening hand and I could play the Sol Ring turn 1, I waited till turn 2 because there's just something about that turn 1 Sol Ring play that really attracts attention from your opponents. If you wait till turn 2 to play your Sol Ring, it probably won't slow you down that much. Again, particularly in a casual game, but it will make a big difference, I think, in the way that your opponents see you. You'd be surprised the difference it makes playing that Sol Ring on turn 2 rather than on turn 1. You can even play it up a little, right? On turn 2, you go, hey, look at that. I drew my Sol Ring off the top. Isn't that lucky? It will make a big difference, I promise you, and it really won't slow you down at all. So even though it might seem like a great advantage to you to get that really fast start, in the grand scheme of things, it actually might become a disadvantage for you. So try to avoid it. Getting to number 2, and this is something that I do all the time, is I never tap out. Never. I am so against tapping out. Unlike the first rule though, in the beginning, it's not really that big deal to tap out. Everyone is doing it. There's not stuff you have to react to. Later in the game though, I almost never tap out. I guess this requires a little bit of explanation for any newer players. Tapping out means I tap down all my mana, right? So on my turn, I'm going to tap tap down all my mana. So on my opponent's turn, I have no mana open, so there's no opportunity for me to do anything, right? Unless I have some of those very specific free spells, and those do exist. And again, that can be a strategy as well, where I have a Fierce Guardianship or Deflecting Swat in my hand. So now I can tap out. My opponents think I can't do anything when I actually can. So you can do that. But if you have removal in your hand, like if I have a Path to Exile in my hand, I always leave one white mana open. I don't want to ever tap out. Again, even if it seems like the best thing to do is to tap out to do a bunch of stuff on my turn, I always leave that one mana open. Or if I'm in a blue deck, I'll always leave that 1 or 2 blue mana open. Even if I don't have something in my hand, again, it's sort of a psychological thing. And I play with my patrons all the time on my Discord, and they just know whenever they're playing against me, they look at that mana open and they go, oh, well, I was gonna cast an Expropriate or a Craterhoof Behemoth, but Demo has 2 blue mana open, so maybe I won't, even if I don't have a counterspell in my hand, right? That's one of the great things about this game. You're playing into the psychological aspect of things because your opponents don't actually know what's in your hand. So you can play some mind games with them where I don't have a counterspell in my hand, but I'm going to leave 2 blue mana open just to make my opponents think that I do, so they don't go off on their turn or they don't cast that big spell because they're worried about it being countered. Or my opponent was going to attack me with that Blightsteel Colossus, but I got 1 white mana open, which means I might have that Path to Exile or I might have that Swords to Plowshares. So they're not going to attack me. They're going to attack someone else because they don't want to lose their creature. Even if I don't have that card in my hand, just leaving the mana open can be a massive advantage for me. I see people tap out on their turn all the time, and I love it. Whenever my opponents tap out, I'm like, yes, now I get to do whatever the heck I want on my turn, and I don't have to worry about my opponents interfering with it. So try not to do it. Leave some mana open, just random mana. Doesn't matter what it is. As long as you have mana untapped, that leaves you open to the opportunity of doing a something when your opponent's doing their big thing. Just do it as a mind game, as a psychological thing, even if you don't actually have an answer in your hand. Try not to tap out if at all possible. And number 3 is a big one, and one that people talk about all the time, which is threat assessment. This is a big one, right? And there's a lot of aspects that come into this. The big one, I think, is removal. I say it all the time, removal wins games. I just did my top removal video a couple of weeks ago, and one of the big things I talked about there is having removal that hits any target, because you never know what your opponents are going to be doing. Maybe it's not a creature that you have to answer, maybe it's an artifact, maybe it's an enchantment, maybe it's even a land. So having versatile removal is important, but even more important is using it appropriately. It feels really, really bad when you have that Beast Within in your deck, which I think is probably the best removal spell in the entire format. Earlier in the game, I've used it to remove my opponent's enchantment. Now later in the game, they have a land or a creature that is just absolutely going to end the game for me, and I don't have an answer for that because Beast Within was the only option in my deck to deal with it. I actually played a game on my Commander gameplay video where I had my Dennick deck and I had used my Generous Gift earlier in the game. My opponent had a Glacial Chasm and I just couldn't close out the game because I just win the game by attacking with that deck, as most decks do. And because my Generous Gift was already gone, the only other option in my deck was Ghost Quarter, so I had to wait. I basically had to draw almost my whole entire deck until I got my Ghost Quarter so I could get that Glacial Chasm off the table and close out the game. So what does this have to do with threat assessment? Well, just make sure you're using that removal appropriately, okay? I see people use their Nature's Claim on a Soul Ring or something like that. I'm just like, ugh, that feels really bad. I know a Soul Ring, again, is one of those cards that just gets up your ire in a Commander game. You don't want to see your opponent having one, but it is only adding mana, right? Feels really, really bad when you use a Nature's Claim on an opponent's Soul Ring, and then a turn later, they play a Rhystic Study or some really, really powerful enchantment or artifact that you're like, well, I wish I still had that Nature's Claim in my hand, because they have something a lot worse now. So make sure you have proper threat assessment when using your removal. That doesn't mean just hold it in your hand forever, waiting for the best thing ever. You do have to wait for the right moment. Sometimes there is an appropriate moment to get that Soul Ring off the table. Usually though, I almost never use my removal on Mana Rocks. That's one of the worst targets. Try to think, how much removal do I have in my hand? How much do I have in my entire deck? If I only have 2 board wipes in my deck, which I don't think is nearly enough, don't cast that board wipe in your hand just to get 4 creatures off the table, because you might not draw a board wipe for the rest of the game, right? Think about that. 99 cards in your deck. It's a singleton format. For the rest of the game, I might not draw a board wipe. So do I want to cast it right now, or do I want to wait till I absolutely have to, right? Always take that into consideration when using your removal. Obviously, this comes into play with counter spells a lot as well. I see people use counter spells in awful ways all the time. I'll just say I'm not a big fan of counterspelling people's commanders. Again, if it's that commander like a Korvold that is really, really powerful, and of course your opponent sort of needs it in order for their deck to get going, that might be a good counterspell target. However, even then, they're in green. Their commander's just going to cost 2 more. They're probably going to ramp, and then the next turn they'll just cast it again. You're not going to slow them down that much. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. Just be careful when countering someone's commander. Sometimes it can be a complete waste of a counterspell. I don't put a lot of counterspells in my deck. I only put like 3 or 4 at most. So I really save them for that game-ending play. My opponent's going to cast that Craterhoof, Expropriate, whatever spell is going to just absolutely end the game or completely ruin the game for me, right? They're going to cast a Bane of Progress, and I happen to be in an artifact tribal or enchantment tribal theme, and it's just going to absolutely destroy me. That's what you should be saving the counterspell for. So threat assessment with counterspells is going to be really important as well. It's also going to be really important when you're just attacking, right? I see this again all the time where people just, I'll just attack some random person. Attack the person that you think is going to be either the biggest threat in the game or the biggest threat to you, right? Again, you're trying to win the game here. So when you're doing your threat assessment, whether it be with your removal or with your attacking or whatever, don't just look for the person that is doing the best necessarily in the game. Look for the person that is going to be causing you personally an issue, right? So if you're in a graveyard deck, the guy with the graveyard hate, maybe their commander is graveyard hate. That's probably going to be the focus of your removal. That's probably going to be the focus of your attacking, right? Because that person is ruining your day with whatever they're doing in their deck. If I'm in a mono red deck, the guy playing the enchantment tribal deck is probably going to be my focus because I can't really deal with enchantments in my mono red deck. So that person is going to be the focus of what I'm doing. If I have a Chaos Warp or a Wild Magic Surge, those are the only 2 cards that I can deal with enchantments with. I am almost assuredly going to be saving those removal spells for the person playing the enchantment tribal deck because that's the only cards I have in my entire deck that can deal with those. And if at a later time they play a Sphere of Safety, I'm going to have to pay like 5-6 mana just to attack with 1 creature. That's the stuff I'm going to want to use my removal on, right? So when you're doing your threat assessment, yes, you should be looking at the person that has a powerful commander, the person that is doing something really, really busted and they're getting lots of value. Maybe they're ramping and drawing cards a lot, but also you want to be looking at what am I doing in my deck and who is the opponent that is going to really be hurting me or opponent that is going to be doing stuff that I can't really stop. That's who you might want to be saving your removal for, and that's who you might want to be focusing your attacks on because it's going to be the hardest for you to deal with that individual opponent. But that is it. That is 3 mistakes that I see people make when playing their commander decks, strategically speaking, right? These are strategies in general that people do in games that I think you should either avoid or move towards when playing your deck. Again, for new commander players, this might be news for you because this format is very different than a lot of other formats. The biggest one being, of course, it is a multiplayer format, so things do work a lot differently. Your threat assessment is going to work a lot differently because you have 3 opponents. So you have to put a lot of thought into where that removal is going to go, where that attacking is going to go. Getting out of the gate really, really fast in any other format's great. In a 4-player format, maybe not so great because it's going to make you the focus of your opponents. Let me know in the comments below whether you think I'm right or wrong about this and what you think is a great strategy to either do or to avoid in a commander game. That is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.